Hello everybody, Shrouded Hand here, and just a quick message before we begin. YouTube have started age restricting some of my videos. If you want to watch my stuff without restrictions, then check out the link to my Odyssey page down below. So yeah, check out my Odyssey and give me a follow on there. Okay, on with the video. The date was the 2nd of December 2001. 3 men were walking through a forest looking for firewood when they found 2 metal cylinders lying on the path. They noticed that strangely all the snow in a 1-meter circle around the cylinders had melted and steam was rising up from the ground around them. One of the men picked up a cylinder and immediately dropped it because the thing was red hot. They were amazed at how these mysterious objects could generate so much heat in the dead of winter and decided, as night was drawing in, to put them to good use. They found a rocky outcrop nearby where they could take shelter. By wrapping a wire around these strange cylinders, they were able to carry them to this shelter. Here they built a campfire, and by sitting with the campfire in front of them and the cylinders behind them, they were able to stay comfortably warm into the night. Later that evening, the men decided to have some vodka. However, after a few swigs, each of them started to feel unusually sick. At first they felt extremely dizzy with a splitting headache. Then the projectile vomiting started. Within an hour of drinking the vodka, all 3 men were puking violently and they continued vomiting through the night. Little did they know, they were experiencing the early stages of radiation sickness. To give a bit of a background, the incident took place in the country of Georgia. The forest they were in overlooked the Enguri Dam. In the 1980s, Georgia was under Soviet control, and the Soviets built a number of radio relays to connect the Enguri Dam to the Shrouded Dam. As the locations were so remote, getting power lines to the relays was impossible, and so they powered them with radioisotope thermoelectric generators. These generators used a radioactive source to create heat, which it then turned into power. These particular generators were the Beta M variety, powered by strontium-90, and generated up to 1,480 tubercules of radioactivity. I have no idea what that means really, but I do know it's probably not a good idea to use one as your own personal heater. In 1991, when Georgia gained independence from the Soviet Union, construction of these radio relays were discontinued. They were left unsupervised and they were soon dismantled for scrap. The radioisotope generators were taken apart and the radioactive parts were discarded. These radioactive sources are what the men found that day. As they sat by the fire, they moved closer to the cylinders to enjoy the unnatural heat radiating from them. 2 of the men estimated they spent around an hour and a half with their backs about 10 centimeters away from the objects. The following morning, after their night of sickness, the men felt very tired and weak. They were only able to carry half the firewood that they collected back to their truck. From there they drove 45 kilometers back to their home village of Leah. So the names of the 3 men weren't released in the report. They were referred to as 1DN, 2MG and 3MB. So for simplicity's sake, I'll just call them Mr. A, B and C. Mr. C was the person who had carried the cylinders with the wires to the rocky outcrop. Mrs. A and B had sat closest to the cylinders with their backs nearly touching them, whereas Mr. C had stayed about a meter away closer to the fire. By the time they got to their village, the vomiting had stopped and everything seemed fine, but The next day, Mr. C experienced diarrhea and his entire body broke out in an itchy rash. He went to the doctor, but he fails to tell his doctor about the strange hot cylinders that they'd found in the woods. The doctors suspect some form of intoxication and possibly an allergic reaction. They give him an infusion of various drugs, and within a day his symptoms clear up. By December the 10th, 8 days after his first exposure to the radiation, Mr. C starts to feel an itching, burning sensation in his right hand. The skin appears flattened and he finds that he cannot bend his fingers. Within a few more days, the skin on his hand would start peeling away. On the 15th of December, Mrs. A and B start to feel the same burning, itching sensation on their backs. Within a few days, their skin also starts to peel away. Mr. A also gets painful blisters in his throat which make him unable to speak. It was only when relatives of the three men noticed that they had similar symptoms that they were persuaded to go to the doctors and tell them about the cylinders that they'd found in the woods. All three men were quickly diagnosed with acute radiation sickness and they were hospitalized to undergo further tests and treatment. Mr. C, the man who had sat furthest away from the cylinders, was able to go home after just a month in hospital. The worst of the radiation had hit his hands from carrying the cylinders, and there was a small area on the back of his legs because he'd briefly sat on the rocky outcrop above the radiation sources. Mrs. A and B didn't respond so well to the treatment. The radiation had penetrated deep into their back and organs, and the skin was peeling away in huge chunks. Realizing that they needed specialist help, Mr. A was flown to the Institute of Biophysics in Moscow, and Mr. B was sent to the Percy Military Hospital in Paris. For both men, the wounds on their back just got worse and worse. The flesh was slowly rotting away, leaving a large open wound. On top of that, the radiation also affected their immune system, leaving them at a high risk of infection. The wounds were cleaned each day, and they were given various antibiotics to try and stave off the infections. Both patients were reported to be in permanent pain, which even the strongest painkillers did little to alleviate. To treat the radiation burns, the decaying flesh needed to be cut away first, and this made the wounds even bigger. Mr. B spent 16 months in near isolation. 3 times the decaying flesh was sliced from his back. Each time they cut deeper, eventually having to remove muscle fibers and dorsal spine vertebrae. Almost his entire back was an open, seeping wound that needed constant attention. The open wound was given a final covering with a vascularized omentum flap, which was selected due to the thoracic localization of the lesion. This means absolutely nothing to me, but apparently it was successful and the wound began to heal. On the 18th of April 2003, 502 days after his first exposure to the radiation, Mr. B was sent home in a stable condition. Mr. A's injuries were the worst. When he was first admitted to hospital, it was found that he had tuberculosis, and so he was unable to receive surgery to his back until the TB was treated. When they eventually did cut away the decaying flesh, they found that the radiation had penetrated deep into his ribcage and organs. Any attempts at skin grafts would fail, the grafted skin quickly turning black and falling away. At first they started taking skin from his thighs to do the grafts, but after a while they ran out of skin to use, and so they started to use expanders on his torso. This is a way of inflating the skin like a balloon so that it stretches and there's more there to graft. But still, despite their efforts, the grafts refused to stick. By July of 2003, after multiple failed grafts, Mr. A had a fever, uncontrollable shivering, and complained of severe pain in his left shoulder. As nurses changed his bandages, they found that 3 of his ribs had fractured, eaten away by the radiation. For almost a year longer he was kept in this state, the open wound dressed and treated each day, but never seeming to heal. On into 2004 it continued, until on the 23rd of April his condition deteriorated rapidly. On the surface of the open wound there was a large amount of pus secretion and a secondary necrosis of the muscles, ribs, shoulder bones and vertebrae increased in depth. Repeated samples taken from the wound identified polyresistant microbes, the largest quantity of which was the blue pus bacillus. He had a high fever and shallow breathing. He was experiencing multiple organ failure and his body was going into shock from the infection. On the 13th of May 2004, 893 days after his first exposure to the radiation, Mr. A had a heart attack and died. As for the radioactive cylinders, they were quickly recovered by local authorities. Although the weather did hamper them a bit, they were then safely disposed of. There were 4 radio relays built originally, and each one was powered by 2 of these radioactive generators. Since the relays were demolished, only 6 of these radioactive cylinders have been recovered, meaning that there's still 2 more out there somewhere in the forests of Georgia. So, are there any lessons to be learned from this? Well, if you find some unnaturally hot pieces of metal in the woods in the dead of winter, it's probably not a good idea to use them as your own personal heater. Or at least when your skin starts peeling off a few days later, you should probably tell your doctor about them. In seriousness though, I doubt much more could have been done for them, except if they'd sought medical advice sooner. After they received the radiation sickness diagnosis, they got the best medical help available, and for one of them it just wasn't enough. It's yet another grim illustration of the horrors of radiation sickness. And on that light note, I want to say thank you for watching. I hope you found the video informative, and I want to say thanks to all those who are supporting the channel. It means a huge amount. And thank you once again for watching. Until next time, goodbye.